Hi. So yes, I am from Becker Medical Library. It is the medical library of Washington University in St. Louis School of Medicine. Very important distinction. We are separate from the main collections over at Olin Library. And so we have about 19,000 rare books in our collections over there. They range from the mid-1400s up to the mid-20th century, mostly focusing on things like anatomy, the history of obstetrics and gynecology, the history of ophthalmology. And then we have this one very interesting collection, the Robert E. Schluter collection in Paracelsus. And so the collection was assembled by Robert Schluter. He was a St. Louis area surgeon. He actually graduated from the St. Louis College of Pharmacy in 1891 and the Missouri Medical College in 1895. And for whatever reason, he was just really interested in Paracelsus. Not entirely sure why. Something about him maybe just spoke to his soul for whatever reason. And so Paracelsus is this kind of my favorite early modern weirdo is what I like to call him. He was working in the 16th century, physician and alchemist known for being very much a troublemaker. And so have any of you guys heard of Paracelsus before? Okay. This is very much a broad overview, so some of you will probably know some of this. Hopefully it is still interesting, and for those of you who know nothing about him, he's a fun guy. You will like him a lot. And so kind of the basic overview is that he is born Theophrastus von Hohenheim in Einsiedeln, which is in Switzerland, in about 1492, 1493. He actually does not take the name Paracelsus until 1529. And there is a common story that the name Paracelsus is supposed to mean greater than Celsus. Celsus was a Roman physician who was known for writing this Text de Re Medica, which is kind of like an encyclopedia of medicine, basically, that was held in very high regard by early modern physicians. That may or may not be true. A lot of things about Paracelsus are very hard to prove. We do know that he generally just sort of liked the prefix para. If you know about his writings, there's a lot of paramirum, paragranum. So it might have just been something that he wanted to use in conjunction with Celsus. He might not necessarily have been spitting on Celsus, although that is also entirely possible given his personality. And so his father, Wilhelm von Hohenheim, was also a physician. The von Hohenheims were a noble family in Swabia, but Wilhelm was he was a bastard. So they're not descended from the actual main branch of the Hohenheims, and so there's kind of a nobility connection, but not really. Paracelsus is definitely salt of the earth. And so later on, he and his father moved to Villach in Austria, which was a huge mining site. Metal was big business there, especially in connection with the Fugger family, who were this extremely wealthy merchant family in the time period. And so it's possible that he got his interest in metal might have come from those early experiences in Villach. And then a lot of his life is kind of uncertain. We know that he studied medicine at the University of Ferrara. He may or may not have actually gotten a degree from there. He wouldn't have cared if he got a degree or not, I think. He didn't really have any great love for academia. And there are also stories that he traveled all around Europe. If this is true, he was one of the most well-traveled people of the time period, because supposedly he went all across the British Isles, he went through Iberia, he went to Russia and got captured by Tatars and was then rescued by the Poles and then traveled through the Slavic lands. So there's this whole grand account of the travels of Paracelsus, but we have no idea if that is true. Maybe there's probably a kernel of truth in it, but we only have Paracelsus's word to take. So take it with a very large grain of Paracalcian salt. And then we know that he did pass away in Salzburg in 1542 after living a life of definitely moving from place to place within the Germanic lands. Not sure about Russia, but he was definitely an itinerant. and you can actually still see his gravesite in Salzburg today. And so I'm actually just going to read you something that he says about himself. So this is Paracelsus talking about himself, which will give you an idea of his personality. And so he says, "By nature, I am not subtly spun, nor is it the custom of my native land to accomplish anything by spinning silk. Nor are we raised on figs, nor on mead, nor on wheaten bread, but on cheese, milk, and oatcakes, which cannot give one a subtle disposition. Moreover, a man clings all his days to what he received in his youth, and my youth was coarse as compared to that of the subtle, pampered, and over-refined. For those who are raised in soft clothes and in women's apartments, and we who are brought up among the pine cones, have trouble understanding one another well. To begin with, I thank God that I was born a German, and praise him for having made me suffer poverty and hunger in my youth." So that is Paracelsus. You can definitely see he has a little bit of an axe to grind with the rest of the world, and he is very unapologetic about that fact. So one thing that a lot of people like to say about Paracelsus is that he is the Luther of medicine. He would have disliked that comparison. He was definitely in favor of religious reform, but he was by no means a Lutheran. But the idea is that, similar to how Luther was basically making the stand against the entrenched traditions of the Catholic Church, Paracelsus was very much against the entrenched traditions of the medical establishment. And so for those of you who don't know too much about early modern medicine, I'm just going to give you a very quick rundown. So basically, medicine in the medieval period and the early modern period is heavily based on Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna. So Galen and Hippocrates are classical physicians, and then Avicenna was an Arabic physician who basically preserved those older Greek and Latin works to be used in medieval Europe. And so from them, we basically get this idea of the four humors. So the body is comprised of these four fluids: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. And when you get sick, it's because they're out of balance, and you need to find a way to balance them. And usually that is done through opposites. Each of these four humors would be cold or dry or moist or hot. And so the idea is that if you have too much of a hot humor, you want to add something cold. So it's very much this idea of curing through opposites. And then there's also a really heavy emphasis in the medieval and early modern period of learning this through book learning. So you can see that all of them are holding books. And so that's kind of the fount of knowledge. There's a really, really strong respect for this classical tradition as passed down through the written word. And so Paracelsus hates that. He basically thinks that Galen, Avicenna, and their medical system is absolute trash. And so he thinks that the best teacher of medicine is nature, and that if you are a true physician, you need to go forth and study the natural world to learn how to heal. And so that's also probably where these stories about his travels come in, and that he was traveling the natural world and learning what all of the herbs from each area had to say to him, because he thought that each area had cures distinct to that place. And so an herb that you could find in Switzerland, it's not going to work quite the same as on an illness in Russia or something like that. The earth will tailor its cures to where you are. He also does not care for this idea of the four humors. He has more of a chemical understanding of the world, and so his central theory are these three principles: salt, sulfur, and mercury. So it's kind of like these three states of matter, where salt is providing the stability, sulfur is the combustion, and then mercury is the liquidity. Alchemy is really central to his worldview. And so he also has this idea that the human body has sort of like an inner alchemist in it. He calls it the archeus. And so basically your little inner alchemist is purifying things. It's removing poisons from the body. And it's also taking the raw food stuff that we ingest and turning it into flesh and blood. We can eat bread and vegetables and fruit, and it turns into us because of our inner alchemist. Our inner alchemist is doing this transmutation. So this is very, very different from our very traditional Galen and Hippocrates worldview. And so one thing about this woodcut too is that this actually comes from one of Paracelsus's first publications on guaiacum. But there on the left, that's meant to show the classical physician. He's wearing his physician's robes, and he's offering this poor soul there kind of like a meager chicken leg while they boil guaiacum in the background. There's a whole thing with Paracelsus and guaiacum, we'll get to that, but basically it's meant to show that the traditional physician is not treating the ill well. If you go to them, you will not get healed. Meanwhile, you have a much more humble person, not with his physician's cap or physician's robes, but he has like the full meal. You will be fed if you go to the humble physician. So it's kind of like your little printed propaganda piece. And he does a lot of that. And so one of the things about Paracelsus is that he is known as the founder of iatrochemistry, medical chemistry, and alchemy is really, really central to this. And so the classic shorthand for alchemy is that it's turning lead into gold, but really the idea is that you are separating the pure from the impure, and you're basically changing matter. And so this was something that a lot of physicians were really interested in because they wanted to isolate the universal panacea, the universal cure. And so instead of compounding different recipes the way that earlier physicians would, Paracelsus was basically trying to separate them down into their very, very purest forms. And his idea with chemicals, things like mercury and things like that, is he could basically liberate the healing virtues from them to use as a cure. And so how do you liberate the chemical virtues? And the key for that is really distillation. Distillation definitely predates Paracelsus, but it's really after Paracelsus's writings spread that you really start to see it take off in medicine. And he makes it more complicated than it needs to be, which is very typical of Paracelsus. So he classifies different products that you could get from distillation. So a quintessence is the most basic one, and that's basically something that you can extract out of corporeal matter. So, if you have herbs and you distill the herbs, you're getting the quintessence of that specific herb. And then he also has things like arcana, which are incorporeal and are used to treat like with like. A lot of Paracelsus is very obscure and difficult to understand. He also has magisteries, which can be separated out from their base substance without any kind of preparation. And then he also has elixirs, which are meant to preserve the body internally. Somehow. A lot of Paracelsus is mostly theoretical. And can be difficult to sort of parse out. Really, the only person who understood his system was actually Paracelsus. But his basic idea is taking these raw substances and refining them down to get at the purest thing that he can use for a cure. And so one of the things about him is that he also believes that like can cure like. So this is different from Galen and Hippocrates, who are believing in curing from opposites. And so this is pretty similar to what the homeopaths were doing later on, except that homeopaths believe in teeny, teeny, tiny doses. They're so small that they're basically ineffective. Paracelsus was not a fan of super, super small doses, but he was very, very concerned with the appropriate dosage. And so one of the things that he's known for saying is that the poison and the cure are basically the same thing. It all comes down to how much you're giving someone, which in his case was very true because he was using things like mercury and acid and vitriol. So in his case, yes, they could be a poison if they were used ineffectively. But some of these cures actually do work to a certain degree. I mean, he's probably most known for using mercury as a cure for syphilis. It does work. It's not going to be a permanent solution, and it's definitely not something that we would ever prescribe for one now, but for a long time it was actually the only effective cure that you could have. And one thing about Paracelsus too. His most famous remedy is actually this thing called laudanum. We don't know for sure what it was. A lot of people say that it was some kind of opiate. Paracelsus refers to opium as opium. So laudanum might have been something else. He also calls it the arcanum. It might have included gold and pearls. We're not 100% sure what exactly it was. But there's a legend that in the hilt of his sword there, it says azoth on there. You can't really see it. Azoth is an alchemical term. It's usually used to refer to mercury, but it also can, especially if you're talking about Paracelsus, it can refer to that universal panacea, which may have been laudanum as well. So there are stories that he would carry this miraculous laudanum in the hilt of his sword. He might also have had a demon in the hilt of his sword. That's another story. I think laudanum might be a little bit more plausible, but who knows? And then there are some Paracelsian remedies that are a little bit more magical. The authenticity of these is very much debatable. So in the collected editions of Paracelsus, there is one work that comes up a lot called the Archidoxus Magicae, and that's where a lot of the Paracelsian talismanic magic comes in. So these are both from that particular text, and those are basically medallions that you would wear on your body. So you would make them out of a specific metal, engrave the right sigils on them, or a magic square like you can see for the moon sigil. And the idea being that it's going to serve as like a protective element or a curing element. So that's where a lot of Paracelsus's reputation as kind of a magician comes from. But even when these were published in the late 1500s, the authenticity of them was a little bit up for debate. There are also some very interesting Paracelsian cures that may or may not have originated with him, but that we know of from later Paracelsians. One of the most well-known of these is the Paracelsian mummy. This is basically, it's essentially human beef jerky is the best way to describe it. So we know that Paracelsus did have this interest in magnets, which was kind of, early modern magnetism is kind of a weird concept, but basically think of it as sympathy between two different objects. So it's not just magnets the way that we would think of it, but like a magnet between your body and someone else's body. There's kind of like an energy connection between it. If you think of it like that, it'll make a little bit more sense. But so Paracelsian mummy is this idea that you would take the body of a young man who has died violently. This is important because that is the most healthy human specimen that you can get. And so then you would basically dry it out and preserve it in wine. So you're making human beef jerky, essentially. And then the idea is that you can use that as a cure because there's this very healthy, vital energy within the body of that young man that can then react with your sicker energy. So that's kind of how it's meant to work. And so we know the most famous recipe for that comes from Oswald Krall, who was a later Paracelsian. Not sure if that originates with Paracelsus himself. And so you guys are at Mobot, so Susie specifically said, please say something about herbs. So Paracelsus is really known mostly for his work with metals and chemicals, but that doesn't mean that he's not interested in herbs. Herbs are still the basis of medicine throughout this time period. And so one of the things that he's interested in with distillation is really getting to these essence of medicinal herbs. He didn't write a traditional herbal, like Leonard Fuchs or or Mattioli or those big, beautiful illustrated ones. He only did write one work that focuses solely on herbs, although they show up in a lot of his texts, and that is the Herbarius. It is very, very, very short. It only has those few chapters on black hellebore, persicaria, salt, English thistle, coral, and magnets again. And so Some of those, if you're thinking of herbals as just the way we think of them as plants, essentially, it looks like kind of a weird list, but I'm sure Susie talked about this when she told you about herbals, but in this time period, herbal really means more materia medica. So an herbal would basically just mean medicinal substances, whether those are plants or minerals or animal parts or whatever. Herbal is a blanket term for materia medica. And so one of the things that comes up in this work, especially if you talk about it in conjunction with his other works, is this doctrine of signatures. And for him, the signature was the spiritual essence of something that would be stamped on its outside. So basically, you can look at a plant and its appearance will give you clues to what it does. So for instance, Persicaria, he said it can cure wounds because a lot of the time it has those kind of red dots on its foliage. So it looks like blood drops, therefore it cures wounds. So that's basically the idea of what's going on with Paracelsus and the doctrine of signatures. And because this was such a very, very brief text, a lot of people really wanted there to be a full-length Paracelsus Herbal. They wanted there to be the equivalent of a Mattioli or a Fuchs. And so after his death, one of the later Paracelsians, Leonard Tournizer, actually publishes an herbal. And he basically calls this Paracelsus's Herbal. He says this is the new Paracelsus Herbal, which was basically a lie. It was all a marketing scheme. It is a very, very pretty book. It's a beautiful print job. It's a very impressive work. But it's clearly not really based on anything that Paracelsus actually wrote. It was just a marketing tactic to get people to buy it. It's really interested in things like astrology and the connections between astrology and the herbs, and also it's interested in language. Like you can see on the right there, that's one of the indices where it's just talking about all the different words and different languages for the different plants, which may or may not be accurate. I will let the linguists debate that. But so even though Paracelsus definitely was interested in herbs, and it's a running theme through his work, sadly, there is no authentic full-length Paracelsian herbal. And so, we don't know a whole lot about Paracelsus's life story, but we know a lot about certain events within it. And it's kind of a little bit of a sad story because he was often his own worst enemy. And so one of the time periods in his life that we know the most about is his time spent in Basel, Switzerland. And it's an interesting story. So Paracelsus does gain a reputation as sort of a miracle worker in Europe. He is known as this traveling doctor who can create great cures with this very unorthodox medicine. And so in 1526, he actually is summoned to Basel to help a printer called Johannes Froben, who had suffered a leg injury that was becoming increasingly painful and no one else could help him. So sure, let's give Paracelsus a shot. And so if any of you are book people, Johannes Froben is one of the most well-known printers in the early modern time period. He was the printer for Erasmus, who is one of the most well-known humanist writers. So he's a very big, influential figure in the town. And so when Paracelsus successfully cures it, this is basically his in. This is Paracelsus's big break. And so the town council appoints him to be the town physician. And so this also gives him the chance to lecture at the University of Basel. So basically, if Paracelsus had just not been Paracelsus, this would have been kind of the high point in his life, and he could have peacefully lived out his time as a lecturer at one of the most prestigious universities. But because he is Paracelsus, he basically shoots himself in the foot, so to speak. So he lectures in German, not Latin, because he does not believe in academic elitism, which is a good thing, but not in the 1500s at the University of Basel. He also was not going to wear those university robes that you saw on the physician in that woodcut I showed earlier. He would show up supposedly in his dirty, stained robes that he would wear when he was doing his experiments. And he also was saying you should not read your textbooks. And so he very famously burned them in public. Supposedly this was a copy of one of Avicenna's texts. We don't know for sure if it was Avicenna, but it wouldn't be a surprise. But so he has this public burning of medical tradition. And at one point, he also supposedly showed the faculty a bowl of steaming human excrement. The idea was that he was going to show them the wonders of medicine, and he shows them a pile of excrement. The idea being that this is the truth of the human body, not your four humors. But unfortunately, it didn't go over very well. He is not making friends. And so eventually someone actually posts a notice up around town. And it was meant to be written by the ghost of Galen, this very prominent Roman physician. And it says, like, to Cacophrastus from the ghost of Galen. So Cacophrastus being a play on Theophrastus with obvious scatological overtones. And so it says things like, Hellebore I send to you to cure your addled brains. True, I don't know your mad alchemical vaporings. I know not what Ares may be, nor Iliadus, nor Archaeus the spirit which you say preserves all living things. All Africa bears not such fabulous fantasies, and yet, you nonsensical fool, you think to speak with me. I don't think you are worthy of carrying Hippocrates' piss pot, or even to feed my swine. So Paracelsus takes this very personally. Understandably, I wouldn't like it either. And actually, one theory is that he actually changes or starts going by Paracelsus rather than Theophrastus because Cacophrastus, it's too much. He can't bear the association, so you just change your name. And so eventually Paracelsus finally is essentially run out of town because his relationships with everyone in Basel are just on a downward slope and it's not getting better. And a lot of what we know about him from this period comes from a letter that was written by his assistant at the time, a gentleman called Johannes Operinus, who we will talk about a little bit later. And it's a very entertaining letter in which he describes his experiences with Paracelsus. And so he says, I have noticed in him neither scholarship nor piety of any kind. The 2 years I passed in his company, he spent in drinking and in gluttony day and night. He could not be found sober an hour or two together, in particular after his departure from Basel. Often he would come home tipsy after midnight, throw himself on his bed in his clothes, wearing his sword, which he said he had obtained from a hangman. He had hardly time to fall asleep when he rose, drew his sword like a madman, threw it on the ground or against the wall, so that sometimes I was afraid he would kill me. Once he nearly killed me. He told me to look at the spirit in his alembic and pushed my nose close to it so that the smoke came into my mouth and nose. I fainted from the virulent vapor. So it sounds like it was a great time living with Paracelsus. But a few notes on it. So this is one of the few accounts that we have from someone who personally knew Paracelsus, but it was also written many years after the two of them had parted ways. At this point, Paracelsus was actually dead. So it is another thing that we should be taking with a grain of Paracelsian salt, but also Operinus does have some complimentary things about Paracelsus too. He does say that even when he was coming home drunk and waving his sword around, he was also so consistent and logical that a sober man could not have improved upon his arguments, which is very impressive. I am not consistent and logical when I am drunk. And also Operinus stayed with him for a long time. He did stick with Paracelsus after he was essentially driven out of Basel, which he did not have to do. So I think that maybe Operinus was a little bit overly harsh on him. So it's one of those things where there's definitely truth in it, but it's also wrapped up in those kind of legends and stories about Paracelsus. So Basel does not go well. And so then he goes on to Nuremberg, which also does not go well. And this is another one of the things that we know more about in terms of Paracelsus's life than a lot of other areas. And so when he goes into Nuremberg, that's really where he starts writing about syphilis. And at the time, the main cure for syphilis is the guaiac wood. Am I pronouncing that right, botanists? Guaiac. Okay, I see some nods. Guaiacum? Okay. So that is basically the standard cure for syphilis at the time, is that you would boil it up and then drink it. And this was also big business. The Fugger family, once again, that very wealthy merchant family, they have business investments in the sale of guaiacum. So it's it's not an effective cure, but there are powerful people who are backing it. And so Paracelsus comes into town and he does what he does best and immediately says, this is useless, you're all fools. You should be using mercury instead, which, once again, not the best of cures, but it is definitely more effective than guaiacum. And so he was actually challenged to cure the syphilitics outside Nuremberg, which he did successfully. But he can't let a good thing go. He kind of has to keep pushing the point. So he publishes a work on syphilis that basically damns everyone in the guaiac trade, says they're all money grubbers and fools and incompetent and so forth. And so after this happens, the town censor suppresses his work. He can no longer be published. And so this is kind of the death knell of Paracelsus's publishing career. It's barely off the ground and it's already dead. And so that is one of the things about Paracelsus, is that he publishes very, very little during his own lifetime. He only has, I think, about 29 works that he publishes while he is still alive. And an interesting thing about that is that most of the works that he published were actually prophecies, because Paracelsus was also a prophet. Why not? And so one of the best-selling print genres in the 16th century are these prognostications and prophecies. And basically that's because people have a lot of anxiety about the end of the world during this time period. Understandably, there's a lot going on. You have the schism between the Catholic Church and the Lutherans. There's the 30 Years' War is kind of rumbling up. There's just a lot of things going on that make people understandably very anxious. So prophecies are kind of a way of helping make sense of it. And so Paracelsus sees a money-making opportunity, and so his works on prophecy really touch on all kinds of things. He would write commentaries on other prophecies that were popular at the time. He would write very short pamphlets that were really just focused on 1 year at a time. And then he would also write on astrology, things like Halley's Comet. He actually wrote on that. And his most impressive one is the one that you can see there. Those are some illustrations from it. And this was the prophecy for the next 24 years. And it was published in 1536 by Heinrich Steiner in Augsburg, who he had a good relationship with. And so this is the one that really combines both the written text and the illustrations. And so the content is pretty standard for prophecies at the time. So the world is headed into a time of turbulence with things like floods and the collapse of kingdoms and things like that. And eventually the elect will be gathered together and live in innocence and joy. And this is going to happen by 1560. So didn't quite work out that way, but they were still actually published even after 1560 as well, because the key to a good prophecy is that it needs to be vague enough that you can just sort of keep massaging it to fit whatever time period, which is why Nostradamus predicted the Vietnam War and things like that. And he also did write a few other prophecies that were published after his death in the compilations. This is kind of an interesting one. There's this series of papal figures that shows up in a couple different prophetic texts from the time period. And it's 30 images that basically show corrupt popes followed by angelic popes. And so the Lutherans grabbed onto this because they wanted it to basically symbolized Martin Luther reforming the church. That image in particular they liked. Paracelsus didn't really agree with that interpretation. He basically felt that the figures would show a new pope who would be selected by God and crowned by the angels, but he would also still understand he was only a man and the only true pope was Christ. So he was also interested in those kind of religious writings as well. As far as the medical works of Paracelsus, the major one that is published in his lifetime is this one, The Great Wound Surgery. He also had those few little pamphlets on syphilis that he managed to sneak out in Nuremberg before he got shut down. But this is the big one. The Great Wound Surgery is really the major work that he managed to get published. And he first attempted to publish it in Ulm by Hans Warnier, but apparently this was kind of a butchered job, and so he then went over to Augsburg, to Heinrich Steiner. And so Steiner had a track record of liberal publishing, so he was a good person to partner up with Paracelsus. Unfortunately, he did eventually go bankrupt before he passed away, but the Wundarzney, the wound surgery, it was a solid financial bet. At the time, there were a number of other German surgical texts being published, and this one actually, it did go through 2 editions in Paracelsus's lifetime, so it was very popular. One thing about it is that it's a very impressive work. It's definitely more heavily illustrated than any other Paracelsian text, but in some ways it's also, there was some cost cutting going on with it. So these 2 images up here, they are from the wound surgery, but Steiner had also published another German surgical text a few years before, the Field Book of Wound Surgery by Hans Gersdorff. And so those 2 woodcuts are directly used from the Gersdorff surgery and just plopped into Paracelsus's. This is done very, very frequently during the time period. There's not really copyright the way that we think of copyright, and so printers would often just reuse woodcuts as a cost-saving measure. So if you have the money to spare, you can commission your own woodcuts for your own work, but usually it's definitely not a surprise that you would just see things being reused over and over and over again. Another thing too is that there are sort of 3 sets of illustrations being used in it. So there are some that are clearly coming from Gersdorff, and then you have some that actually look a little bit older in style. They look maybe more like they're coming from the 1400s or early 1500s. And then you have some that are still another completely different style. So it looks like Steiner was pulling from just a lot of different woodblocks that he had on hand. They don't look like they were actually commissioned specifically for Paracelsus's work. If any of you book people are looking for a PhD project or anything, I think tracing these, this is a project for you. Please do it, because I would like to know what you find. And so this work as a whole, it covers a lot of the standard topics that you would expect to see in a surgical work. So how to treat broken bones, how to treat poisons. Also, it does start talking about how to treat gunshot wounds, wounds from gunpowder. So it's definitely tying into this period where that is becoming more of a feature in European warfare and then medicine. And so basically Paracelsus, he dies in Salzburg, so only 6 years after the wound surgery is published. And so he really takes off actually after his death. So a number of figures started to collect and swap the handwritten monographs that he left behind. And so there are a few key figures who really preserved Paracelsus's legacy. One of them was Adam von Bodenstein, and he had converted to Paracelsian medicine after he had a fever that was cured by one of Paracelsus's remedies. And so after that, he basically converted to the cause, and he managed to get a number of the original manuscripts. I've heard that he actually got them from Operinus since he was at Basel. And then he had them printed, which actually got him expelled from the medical faculty at Basel, so there was definitely some bad blood there. Michael Toxides was also one of Bodenstein's colleagues who also was collecting and preserving the manuscripts. And then there is Johannes Huser, who actually published the first real comprehensive run of Paracelsus texts in the late 1500s. That's the title page for the original Huser edition, and then that is a later edition with a much more elaborate frontispital page. And so that is actually Hermes Trismegistus on the right, a very well-known figure in kind of occult and alchemical studies. So they're really starting to lean into sort of Paracelsus the magus. And so Paracelsus, his theories of iatrochemistry and medical chemistry remain really popular throughout the 1600s, and then in the 1700s, you definitely start to see a drop off, and then he kind of fades more and more into obscurity until we end up with weird random references to him in Harry Potter and things like that. But so kind of just to sum up, Paracelsus's motto that you see on a lot of his pictures kind of surrounding at the top there, in German, it is eins andern Nicht soll niemand sein, der für sich bleiben kann allein. And so that basically means let no man belong to another who can belong to himself. And so I think that that pretty much does sum him up. I mean, even though he never quite got the recognition that he may have wanted during his lifetime, he always pretty much stood by what he believed in. He could have remained quiet in Basel or Nuremberg and become the town physician, but he did not want to stand for that. He was absolutely himself. And so hopefully you are now Paracelsus fans as well. So yeah, thanks.